Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of Guyana's Oil and You with yours truly, editor at Kaieteur News, Guyana Wilberg. Joining us virtually tonight is a man who sits at the helm of the Environmental Protection Agency, Mr. Kaieteur Radio. Sir, welcome and thanks for being here with us.
Good night, and thank you, Kiana. I am glad to be here tonight to speak with you and provide some information to the general public on this very important aspect of the environment and particularly the role of the EPA. So thank you once again for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you as well, sir. So for our discussion tonight, we have quite a few topics to explore, as well as setting the record straight on a few issues such as flaring, as well as insurance in the case of an unmitigated oil spill. So without further delay, I'll head straight into our questions for tonight. Mr. Parterm, there's been considerable increase in the requests for project approvals, particularly as it relates to the oil sector. But what we have seen on this end is that some projects require an environmental impact assessment while others do not. How does the EPA, therefore, goes about making a determination on this front?
Thank you again, Kiana. And this is a very, very good question. And of course, it's very much in the media. So I'm glad to provide a response and some clarity on this. Each application for an environmental authorization, whether oil and gas related or not, undergoes a meticulous process of screening. Screening is basically the first stage of the environmental authorization process that informs our decision on whether an environmental impact assessment, what we term EIA, is required or not. And this is provided for in Section 11.2 of the Environmental Protection Act. And that the Act provides that this agency, the EPA, is the competent authority to make either of those two decisions. But this is obviously informed by the screening process that we undertake in any application that we receive. Screening includes, but not limited to, some of the following aspects. We look at an evaluation of the project summaries or any other information provided to the agency as part of the application. Or the agency may request some additional information. For example, there may be existing environmental assessments done, or the information is available in studies done in similar areas and available to the agency. And then secondly, we conduct site inspections, or staff do this, where they start first with using satellite and GIS data available to us to examine the proposed location and to see what ecological or social components that may be potentially affected. And also, where feasible, and it's a common practice, we physically go underground to ground truth and to verify the information provided in the application and to bolster our understanding from our GIS screening and stuff like that. Then, importantly, we also engage and seek guidance and information as necessary from stakeholders. Okay. And these include our government agencies, and especially in a particular area where proposed activity is to be held, there may be residents or concerned citizens in that area. And during that ground truthing or physical site inspections, we will engage residents to get inputs from them. Now, with all of this assessment, the responsible unit, or we're categorized, we have various units that deal with different types of project or different sectors. These officers, they assess the information from all of this activity and make an informed recommendation for the approval of the executive director. Again, I must say that this always has been and continues to be the practice of the agency, and is very much similar to what obtains across the globe for in similar regulatory agencies. And especially where consideration of an application for a proposed project, screening is a critical component and is the basis on which decisions are made. Now, upon completion of the screening, the agency may find that there is uncertainty of impacts. There may be need for more information that is not readily available to us at the time, or the environmental impacts are sensitive, diverse, or may be unprecedented. These impacts may affect, a broad area other than the sites or facilities that are subject to the specific activities. And as a result, we consider that the project may significantly affect the environment, and therefore will require the conduct of a full-scale EIA, as provided for in Section 11 of the Environmental Protection Act. On the other hand, we may have enough information from the project summary or other technical and scientific studies, existing environmental assessments, our internal or, if needs be, external expertise, which we may often rely on, that we find adequate enough to help us determine that the impacts will not be significant, will not be irreversible, will not be long-term, and hence a decision that a project will therefore not significantly affect the environment. And so therefore it is therefore exempt from an EIA. And this is what we publish in the newspapers on particular applications. So in essence, Guyana, the proposed project can have potential environmental impacts, but less adverse than those requiring an EIA. And again, I mentioned these impacts may be site-specific, and few, if any of them, are irreversible. And in most cases, there are mitigation measures or options which can be designed or implemented very readily. Or on the very, very low scale, the proposed project is likely to have minimal or no adverse environmental impacts. And therefore, beyond the screening, no further environmental assessment is required. There will always be some amount of impacts on the environment wherever development is concerned. There's never zero impacts. The question is whether impacts may be significant or not. And what the agency does is assess these proposed activities, identify and take into account potential impacts and require further information to guide its decision, or to grant or to refuse to grant an environmental authorization. Now, where the agency determined that no EIA is required, it is in no way communicating that there are no impacts at all in the environment. Neither is it communicating that the project is approved. I think this is a common misconception.
Yes.
It is simply, or we are simply stating that in the specific instance, taking into account the size, the scope, the location, the design, environmental information available to us, the agency as the competent authority and conducted a competent evaluation are able to determine that a full-scale EIA study, as set out in Section 11 of the Act, is therefore not required to guide our decision. The agency can inform its decision based on information provided, or may require some additional specific issues be addressed, and mitigation measures proposed through the preparation of an environmental management plan. And an environmental management plan typically considers baseline data, monitoring requirements, and mitigation measures, which would ensure that the project, once approved, is undertaken in an environmentally sound and sustainable manner. So, Guyana, probably a lot has been said there, but this is, in a nutshell, what we do to guide our decision to determine whether we require an EIA or we don't require an EIA.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, I'd like to just focus a bit on the environmental impact assessment, because that is usually a very massive document, as we would have seen in the case with the EIAs that have been submitted for many of the projects ExxonMobil has pursued, and other companies as well. Now, my question with this now, with a document that is over sometimes 200 pages. How does the EPA go about fact checking such documents, especially as it relates to the oil sector that is pretty much new to all of our regulators?
Yeah, very good question again, I must say, Kiana. And yes, with the oil sector, if I can show you, I'll probably switch my camera and show you the large volumes of information, provided by these operators, what you call an environmental impact statement. Kiana, the EPA is ably assisted by its suitably qualified staff. And as well, in addition to staff, there is an independent environmental assessment board called the EAB, provided for by the Act, but it's independent of the EPA, and with suitably qualified individuals represented on that board. And we also seek external experts or consultants to help us, if necessary, in scrutinizing or interrogating these EIA or environmental impact statements provided to us. So no decision was ever or will ever be taken without proper due diligence. In fact, the EIAs for current offshore developments were also reviewed. I'm talking about the 1-2, Lisa 1-2, and Payara, but they were reviewed by separate international experts, in addition to this environmental assessment board and the EPA. So the combination of those reviews, the independent expertise, the EAB, and the EPA staff internally helps us to adequately scrutinize these environmental impact assessments and help us in guiding our decisions to approve or not approve a particular project.
Okay. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the aspect of the international experts, because that was going to be part of my follow-up, the extent to which the EPA employs the help of persons who are experts in this field to help you pinpoint loopholes for this sector that's, quite new to all of us. And on that note, I'd like to bring your attention to an article that's been making the rounds from The Guardian, which cited a petroleum engineer, Mr. Robert Bay, who said that ExxonMobil has provided Guyana with perhaps an improbable and overly optimistic safety plan as part of its EIA in the case of oil spills, or what it would do in the event of a well blowout. And he noted, for example, that ExxonMobil is proposing to use a dispersant that's been banned in the UK and deemed to be highly toxic. What does the EPA do? What course of action do you take when issues such as these are brought to the attention or make their way into the media? Is there sort of another review process that takes place?
Well, Kiana, thanks again. Mr. Robert Bay, I don't know him. First time I'm hearing of him, and based on what was written, he seems to be well, knowledgeable. Mm-hmm. Now, he has done his review as provided for in The Guardian, but as I just indicated, we had external expertise, independent and external expertise who reviewed these EIAs and made recommendations to us. And based on those recommendations, we thought it feasible, that we can go ahead with the project with the mitigation measures proposed. As I mentioned, no project will not have impacts. It's just a matter of how they're treated, how they're proposed to be managed. And once we are comfortable that it could be, it could be mitigated and it could be managed. Now, to answer your question, if we do further reviews. Now, when an EIA is reviewed and the recommendations made to us, we also take into consideration the public review during that process. Mm-hmm. And as well as the EAB's recommendation in coming up to that decision to issue an environmental permit. And then within that permit that we issue, we stipulate specific measures that will ensure that, the various mitigation measures, the various safeguards are adhered to and are ensured, are implemented by the operator. If there are any gaps or anything, we may require further studies or further reviews to be done. And this has been a practice for us. We can never have all the information available to us at any point in time. And so we kind of rely, or we would go back to independent experts as necessary. Fortunately, this has not been the case. Some of the issues, I did see that article, and some of the issues raised, we are making efforts to bringing them to the fore and to addressing them, going forward.
So those issues that were highlighted in The Guardian, the EPA has taken note of it, and you're actively looking at ways to address same with Exxon.
Correct. And but I'm not saying that I'm agreeing that those things are necessarily missing, but we've taken note, and we are engaging, and we're going back to see whether we have those things in place. And so far, I would say certain things that you mentioned, we're ensuring that it's there and ensuring that it's actually written into the permit.
Thank you very much. Now let's turn to staffing, because this is one of the areas that the EPA has received a lot of criticisms for. There's the perception that the EPA is not capable of managing the sector and standing up to oil companies if infractions are found. What are your thoughts on these perceptions?
Immediately, Guyana, I would say they're uncalled for and not true. Look, the EPA has been in existence for some 25 years. And obviously, we would have built up significant experience in environmental management, particularly in meeting our obligations under the Act. And 25 years is a lot of years, a lot of experience. We also have in our employ, and continue to employ, a cadre of professional staff with various, appropriate qualifications and experience. And these are, in keeping with what we want to achieve and meeting our obligations in terms of our mandate. An organization will always want more, and the best possible resources, but, both human and financial. But you and I know that this is not always realistic. So, what do we do in this case? The agency has to strategize, will have to innovate and make the best use of its resources towards ensuring it achieves its mandate. So it's not about, that we are incapable, or we don't have enough staff, or we don't have enough resources. It is ensuring that we have the critical expertise, and we can access this, as I mentioned before, both internally and externally. And that we have the right tools, and ensuring we follow the Act. That being said, we are in the process of recruiting additional staff for all the various departments of the agency. And we also engage in continuous training of our staff to meet new standards and requirements as needed. And the main aspect of your question, the EPA is not just about being big and bad. We have, in this modern era of environmental regulatory posture, and this, you check any agency in Australia, in the US, it's not just coming with a big stick. It is a partnership. It is compliance assistance. It is cooperation. It is collaboration. And when you take that approach, you're likely, and the experience has proven, you're likely to ensure that the operators or the permittee or the permit holder wants and ensures achievement of compliance. And that has been our process, and that is what we'll continue to do, is to work with our various permit holders, developers, to bring them into compliance. And that is the role of the EPA. And the EPA has and will continue to do that.
Thank you, sir. Now, in terms of the funding, because I know previously, because of what took place with COVID-19, as well as with the 2020 elections saga, there wasn't much that could have been done to ensure funding, the necessary funding was secured for the EPA to build sort of a lean, mean oil and gas arm. So how are you building that out now for the 2022 budget? What is your funding looking like for building that sort of arm that is needed to man the sector?
Well, I must say, our budget for 2021 was approved basically in full. And I must thank the government and to the Ministry of Finance and our parent ministry, and they approved that full budget. So we had that budget to do what we had to do. Yes, COVID obviously impacted in terms of our ability to, engage and go out to all the various areas to address the various type of activities. We had to resort to other methods, of having developers report or permit holders report, had remote meetings and so on. Going forward for 2022, we've put in recently, actually just finished preparing that budget, and we expect the same result, in terms of the monies to be provided and the other resources to be provided by government as part of a subvention. We also have a trust fund, and that trust fund is in good standing, that we can rely on and utilize for the operation of the agency.
But would you be able to give us at least an estimate of how much you would need or how much you're asking for to build up the capacity of the EPA in terms of regulating the oil and gas sector?
Well, Guyana is not really about how much money. As I mentioned in my previous explanation, that we may never have all the best or the ideal situation. We have, as I said, we have a cadre of professionals. They're adequately skilled, they're knowledgeable, and they constantly do a combination of approaches to ensure that we meet our compliance and enforcement posture with all sectors. And we innovate, and there are modern aspects of getting and ensuring of monitoring these permitted facilities. You can do that physically by doing intermittent compliance visits or audits. You can do it remotely, and in fact, this is one area that we're building, and it probably feeds into the question specific that you're asking. We have some funding from an international agency and through the government of Guyana to develop an environmental information management system. What this is really going to do is build our capacity to implement remote real-time monitoring for operators offshore, for example. And you would have heard of the operators in the Starbuck block bringing a fiber optic cable to shore.
Yes.
So we're preparing our system here in-house to tie into that system so that we can see, how much flare gas is happening at a set time, if we allow that, of course. See how much produced water is discharged as we have allowed, to the standards we have allowed, of course. And so we can see what's going on the. And this is not just in the oil and gas sector, it's across the mining sector, the forestry sector. But obviously, it can't happen overnight, and we will build on that.
Since you've mentioned the environmental information management system, how soon does the EPA expect to have this up and running?
Right, I'm desperately working on it right now. We should have the infrastructure in-house ready and set up by year end. And this is, let me qualify this. It has to be a phased approach. We will not have the full, ideal fully functioning system by year end. What we're doing in-house is basically setting up the capabilities in-house so that we can link to the various operators and the other aspects to receive and to provide information.
How much is this entire project expected to cost?
Well, I can tell you the funding we have for this physical computer system and software and so on and setting up about 125,000 US, that we have.
Okay.
And of course, this is in addition to what the government of Guyana has provided and in addition to what we have in our trust fund. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to look at insurance because this is a matter that many have asked a lot of questions about as it relates to whether Guyana has full coverage insurance to deal with the costs that would be associated with an unmitigated oil spill. And Mr. Parasram, I know that you're quite aware that Kaieteur News has reported on this matter for quite some time. And one of the things the experts that we've consulted have said is they've advised us to tie the parent companies of the Stabroek Block subsidiaries to this insurance. Has the EPA been able to get an agreement on this front?
Okay, thanks, Guyana. I must start off by saying, part 6, section 30, if I recall correctly, and 31 of the Act categorically provides for the agency at its discretion to require financial assurance. So we have the legal backing to do so. I want to let the public know, and as well as Kaieteur News, to be rest assured that the provision for financial assurance, and in this case what we call insurance, is and will be in any permits we issue for oil and gas related projects, and any other project we see fit. Now, the agency is currently in discussions with the operators of the Stabroek Block, particularly where current environmental permits have been issued regarding insurance coverage. When this is concluded, I'm sure the decision will be made public. At this time, to avoid biasing that discussion, I prefer not to go into any detail to address this at this time. What I can say is that we are looking at various options available to us. And this is guided by consultation with experts in the field, our government sister agencies, and what obtains internationally in terms of the practice. And all of this will be used to guide our decision and in our discussions and negotiations with the operators. I must also say that the operators have been forthcoming and providing information for discussions and consideration. So, that's what I can say at this point in time, and rest assured that that is an area that we're desperately working with the operators to come up with an agreed solution. And in the interim, as you all aware, the existing permits have the conditions for financial assurance, and we have received financial assurance, and it covers some of the key aspects typical and recommended, like the operator extra expenses, well blowout aspects and so on. But that being said, we will work and we have that commitment with the operators to work together to come up with ensuring that we are adequately comfortable that there is capability to provide any financial responses to any potential, and knock wood, that we do not have any major environmental disaster.
Thank you very much for that, sir. Now, I'd like to look at the legislative aspect of this discussion tonight. There has been a lot of attention placed on the need for Guyana to strengthen its legislative framework, particularly as it relates to the environment. And the reason why I'm bringing this matter up is because we have seen an influx in the importation of chemicals and dispersants for the oil sector. Now, how is the EPA treating with that matter? Are you looking at separate regulations to deal with that? Because as we would have seen in many countries, there is a regulation to govern how those chemicals are supposed to be imported and how they are supposed to be stored, and what happens in the event if those measures or regulations are breached.
All right. Thanks again, Kiana. I just, before I answer specifically about your question about regulations and so on, dispersants is indeed at the forefront of our review currently.
Okay.
And we are also discussing with the operators about this. And what we want to be clear about, what is the policy, or we want to develop a policy on when and only when we really need to use dispersants. Now, in the system, in the EIAs, they provide what you call NEBA, net environmental benefit analysis. And there are various tiers of, whenever a particular type of spill, and what approaches and methods and technology used to address the various tiers of spills. As the world over, is when only and only when other available approaches or methods or technology is not available or can't deal with this situation, then and only the last resort are perhaps dispersals. So we're not now, trying to get that clear understanding, to make sure that they exhaust all other means first, and to be clear as to when and agree as to when dispersants will be used, if necessary. And of course, looking at the environmental impacts if it has to be used, and under what situation. All right. And so that is what we're doing. Now, in terms of, our act and regulations and for other chemicals and what's not, I must also mention to you that is the Pesticide and Toxic Chemicals Board. And we partner with that board, who has the authority to authorize importation, storage, handling, and so on of chemicals. And so we're working in partnership with that agency, very close partnership. In fact, we are on its board as well.
Okay.
We are currently reviewing the Act and our regulations. Again, I would say when this process is completed, we'll be able to determine what aspects needs addressing, if at all. However, I want to clearly say in the Act, in my opinion, and from my experience over the years dealing with the Act, is currently broad and all-encompassing, and can therefore be applied to any situation or to any sector. It's a very good Act. You ask anybody the world over, the Act is a very good Act in terms of what it intends to do in terms of environmental management and the mandate of the EPA. What may be required is perhaps promulgation of specific regulations, as
Yes.
we refer to. Things like compliance and enforcement, like using administrative penalties and civil penalties rather than going to the courts and so on if we need to do enforcement. So those types of regulations, and any other regulation perhaps to provide some other clarity on some things if it's not that clear. So our review internally and with help from elsewhere will help us to determine and where those gaps or where there's no clarity or there's need for further clarity. The Act provides for promulgation of regulations, and we'll utilize those once necessary.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, let's talk about a very heated matter, and that has to do with flaring, quite a hot topic in Guyana. Can you say how much money we've received thus far from ExxonMobil under the new arrangement that is in its environmental permit for the calculation of flaring that happens beyond a particular time? And how many applications has the company made for flaring since the amended permit?
Kiana, I probably would want to take a slightly different angle to that question.
Okay.
And if you permit me, and I'll answer your question as well. But let me start with this.
Sure.
The EPA, and by extension, the government of Guyana's policy is zero routine flaring. Flaring is only permitted in circumstances where it is necessary to ensure safety and in cases of emergencies. And that's in the permits that we have issued. We all know that there is an issue with the gas compressor, and the EPA has been engaged with the operator. And we have agreed on a way in how we can achieve compliance in this regard. It must be noted, that the operator has and continues to show efforts in addressing the issue and meeting compliance. We have weekly meetings to discuss status and, and progress in meeting this agreed compliance. In fact, the flaring, you probably heard in the past, that we're flaring probably about 15 million standard cubic feet per day.
Mm-hmm.
I am glad to say that flaring has been reduced to 6 million standard cubic feet per day. We're not at pilot flare, as yet, but based on the information provided to us and the discussions that we've had, the plan is to fix this issue completely by year end. And based on the efforts and the progress we've seen so far, we find this reasonable. And we've seen the improvements and also the willingness of the operator to make every effort to comply. The important thing here is not so much about how much money or how many applications, but rather that there is real effort at achieving compliance and a clear plan to solving the issue. And again, I must emphasize that we've seen the progress and the effort in this regard. You are aware that we charged $30 per ton of
Yes.
CO2 emissions.
Yes, sir.
We have raised that to $45 per ton.
Oh,
Right? And we're seeing this as whilst we're having the engagement and the cooperation and seeing the end of this issue, we still think just another means or another layer of ensuring compliance, that this will serve as an incentive to the operator to achieve compliance, because they would not want to spend too much money, and money is important, of course. So that is where we are, and that is the critical issue, and that is what I want the public to know. And we will ensure, and again, the EPA is working assiduously and in partnership, and there's willingness on the part of the operator to deal with this issue so that we can meet our zero routine flaring option.
Mr. Parsaram, thank you very much for that response, but just a few clarifications. And
Sure.
I would like to get back to the crux of the question that was posed, which is to understand how much we have received from ExxonMobil since the I don't know if you'd be okay with this characterization, since the penalty on flaring has been implemented, the $30 per ton, and since the 45 has been increased. Is it that you prefer not to say how much we have received?
I don't think it's something that I can need to not share, but I prefer not to. But okay, you probably got me into this one. It's about roughly, we have received about 400, roughly about 400. I'm trying to remember the figure off my head. Probably about $400 million so far.
Okay.
Roughly. Yeah.
Okay. And when was the 45, when was the increase in the penalty, when was that taken?
We took that, the operator came back and when we discussed the issue, and we found that it was brought down to 6 million standard cubic feet per day. And the plan that we agreed on, that by December, we should have everything in play. So in the last month or so, we raised that to 45. I can't remember the specific date.
Okay. Okay. Now, just a final question. What would be the status quo after year end on the issue of flaring? Is it the intention to raise the penalty again, or will it continue to be at 45?
Well, I expect at year end that this issue will be solved. And we will, because we agreed to a plan, and that's what we're working with. That being said, when that bridge comes, we will decide and we'll cross that bridge then. But my intention is to see that this matter is solved by the end of the year.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, sir. Now, before I ask you for your closing thoughts, there's a question that was sent in by the BBC for you. And that question says, what do you think of the oil activity and what it might be doing to the environment?
Okay, Kiana, is not what I think. And as I mentioned, in any application we receive, that's what the agency is here for. And that all those things I mentioned earlier about evaluating an application and determining if an EIA is required or not. And in these cases, these type of development, we always require an EIA. And the EIA guides our decision and guides and provides the information on whether this oil activity can be implemented. Now, that is my role and function. And that is what we have been doing here at the EPA. So that's my answer in response to that question.
Thank you very much, sir. With that said, I'd invite you to provide us with your concluding thoughts on the performance of the Environmental Protection Agency and what we can expect from you in terms of your vision to develop the agency.
Thank you again. Well, the EPA continues to adapt to the emerging challenges which are associated with environmental management in general in Guyana. The EPA has been and will continue to leverage its experience as well as the support it receives from sister agencies, the ministries and international bodies towards the execution of its statutory mandate. Undoubtedly, as the agency continue to adapt and develop, it will continue to ensure that the environment is protected and that natural resources are sustainably developed for the benefit of all Guyanese. My approach to continued strengthening of the agency is fourfold.
Okay.
One, I mentioned the review and adherence to the Environmental Protection Act and the regulation, including updating and or promulgating any new applicable regulations as necessary. The key thing here is to ensure that the agency adheres to the Environmental Protection Act. Secondly, that we continue ensure that our staff capability is built. In fact, we're now instituting a dedicated training arm within our HR department so that the on-the-job training and so on that is required to continue to increase our capacity will be implemented and staff can benefit from those. Thirdly, as I mentioned and I hinted in several of the responses, us leveraging technology for remote real-time monitoring, information gathering and reporting. And as I mentioned, we're setting up this in-house platform to link with operators as they become available for monitoring and reporting. I think that is a critical step, is that back and forth, two-way flow of information, which we can then also make available to the public to increase our transparency, And then finally, we aim to be a world-class regulator and ensure that we achieve organizational excellence and ensuring that all stakeholders are aware of their obligations and have clear understanding of what they can expect of the agency. And that's important. It's not always what we want from the regulated community, but it's also what they can expect of us. We are ensuring an approach of being a client service-oriented agency, both to developers and to the general citizens. We will, and as is typical of any modern regulator, to provide compliance assistance and work in partnership to ensure compliance, but apply strict liability and the full extent of the law when it's necessary, when there are severe breaches or there's some sort of consistent non-compliance. That, in a nutshell, is how I see us moving forward for the agency.
All right, Mr. Parzuram, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. Certainly, our listeners and our viewers on Facebook Live would have learned quite a lot about the work of the EPA. So we thank you very much for taking the time to share this information with us. Crucial information, that is. So without further ado, sir, thank you once again. We do hope that you have a wonderful evening. And to our listeners and viewers, do have a wonderful night. Please continue to stay safe. Practice social distancing and continue to wear your mask, please. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you and good night, Guyana. Thank you, Kiana.
Good night, Mr. Parzuram.